Well, greetings and welcome to my office here at the Highland Oaks Church of Christ here in Dallas, Texas. Thank you so much for joining us as we continue our study in the Beatitudes. In fact, not just continuing, but bringing this study to a landing. I just want to thank you. I don't take for granted that some of you log on every week and join us for this study, and I'm so grateful that you are patient and willing to listen to some of my thoughts and some of my reflections as we've gone through the Beatitudes together. I can't stress enough how important it is for us to come back to the Sermon on the Mount, this central teaching of Jesus. So much of our Christian life ought to be centered on the story of Jesus. Now, you may be saying, well, so much, shouldn't all of it be centered on the story of Jesus? Well, of course, but I don't want to discount the beautiful rhythms of the Old Testament and the cries of the prophets and the songs of the Psalms, or even Paul's letters and letters like 1st and 2nd and 3rd John and 1st and 2nd Peter. These are all worthwhile bits of pastoral instruction, encouragement, but as disciples of Jesus, Jesus ought to be the lens through which we see everything else. This is what I think Paul means by the matters of most or first importance right there in 1 Corinthians 15. Of what I received, I now pass on to you, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. In other words, the story of Jesus stands in front of all other texts, all other stories. And the problem a lot of times with our churches, even when we deal with issues like race and how we treat people, and even things that happen in our assembly. You remember those arguments we used to have about lifting hands or how somebody should be baptized? You see, to me, that's when the issue becomes looking at Jesus through the issue rather than allowing the story of Jesus to become the lens or the glasses through which we view everything else. That's why the Sermon on the Mount matters. That's why the Beatitudes matter. So let's continue as we dive into this final Beatitude. If you've joined us for the first time, then this may not make a lot of sense, but the Beatitudes are a lot like traveling up a mountain where you travel up to meet God through things like mercy and mourning and becoming meek. And then as you begin to travel back down the mountain into your interaction and relationships with people, you begin to understand the value of being merciful and being a peacemaker, and today even being persecuted. So let's pray, and then we'll dive right into what it means when Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." God, thank you for this opportunity to study the Bible. Thank you for your words. Thank you that you revealed yourself fully in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And now Jesus lives in us and through us, through you, Holy Spirit, that enable us and empower us to be more loving and gentle and kind and even faithful. God, you are with us in every way, and I'm grateful for the story, but this morning especially for the story of Jesus as it's revealed in these short instructions, invitations to live deeper in life with you. It's in your name that I pray. Amen. So if you were to write a movie script, or even begin to write a novel about persecution, what would be the plot line? My hunch is when most Christians, when most Christ followers think about persecution, they don't think about themselves. They think about these radical ways that people over the centuries, and even more closely to our world and time, people in other countries are persecuted, are jailed, even killed for their belief in Christ. I remember telling a story that I read in student ministry to kind of capture the strength of the Christian persecution. When in Nazi Germany, some well-meaning Christians, not Jews, but some well-meaning Christians were worshiping inside of their home. And all of a sudden, there was a huge knock at the door. And there were those outside with weapons drawn, and they were banging on the door, demanding to come in. And they finally let them in, and it was clear what the family was doing. They were having a worship service. Bibles were open. And the folks with drawn weapons simply asked, I need to know if you are professing Jesus as Lord. And if you do profess Jesus as Lord, there will be consequences. It was clear that the family that was worshiping and studying the Bible felt like their life was being threatened. And the father stood up and said, yes, that is exactly what we're doing, and we will suffer whatever consequence comes our way. And at that moment, the people with drawn weapons put their weapons down and said, good. We just wanted to know if we were going to be partnering with those who really took their faith seriously. It's a great story, but what it does is that it gives us the idea that in order to take our faith seriously, then we must be faced with the threat of death. And let's be honest, there's not a lot of people here in the United States and in the West who are threatened by death. And I don't want to discount persecution. Never in a million years would I want to take away from the deep convictions of the martyrs and lessons that we can learn about the extraordinary strength of people's faith in the midst of significant Christian persecution and trials. But I think that's why Jesus doesn't just talk about persecution in that sense, but rather this is the only beatitude that Jesus adds something to. Listen to the next verse. After Jesus talks about persecution, he also says, and blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you by uttering all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. In other words, persecution is not just physical harm. It can also be verbal assaults, these vicious attacks on your motives, or when you do live out your faith in the living Christ in a way that you feel led or called to, and somebody makes fun of you or picks on you. I remember going to a soccer camp at Indiana University, not a Christian university, pretty pagan if you ask me, as a high school student. And my brother was in middle school and he went with me as well. We spent a whole week. Indiana was one of the top soccer schools in the country, and several from our little podunk town in Tennessee got to go up and go to soccer camp there. Well, I remember my brother being pretty downcast one afternoon, and during free time, I just went up to him and I said, Nathan, what's wrong? And he said, Pat, these people keep calling me names and making fun of me. I said, really? Why? And he goes, well, they keep calling me the Pope. It's like, well, why would they do that? He said, Pat, because at night they start telling jokes and they start telling stories that really make me uncomfortable. And I tell them that they shouldn't talk like that, so they make fun of me and call me the Pope. Now, that may be a little extreme, but it struck me that here was my brother being attacked verbally just because he was taking a stand for what he felt like was right and good. To me, that's what Jesus is talking about. When you are headed in the direction of Christ and you live in such a way and yet you face pressure and insult and an attack on your motives because you don't feel like that's helpful to conform to that particular way of living. Even my sister, when she was in high school, was really ridiculed because she wanted to go on a mission trip instead of to a sports camp for her entire team. Her coach gave her such a hard time, even challenged her commitment to the school and to the sport. And my sister felt like the coach was challenging her commitment to her school because the school ought to take precedence over her faith in Christ. To me, that's what Jesus is aiming at. So, how do we respond? Jesus says, rejoice and be glad. Now, do you think Jesus is really asking us to just suck it up and be happy and take criticism? Well, as I've learned in my life, there are a number of ways to respond to criticism. Even in the story of Jesus, Jesus didn't always respond to criticism by turning over tables. Jesus didn't always respond to criticism with some sharp return that was deeply embedded in Scripture. But think about how we respond. Do we respond or do we react? Because sometimes you can respond by backing down and accommodating to what the other person needs. And that's really hard, isn't it? When you have to back down from what you might even feel worthwhile to defend, and accommodating what somebody else might say or think or do. And it's hard to take the higher road, isn't it, when someone is accusing you of something that is wrong. I'm mindful of the story of Jesus, and when Pilate looked at Jesus and said, Jesus, what is truth? Jesus, here you stand, accused, you not have anything to say. And do you know what Jesus said? Pretty much nothing. I mean, when's the last time somebody accused you of something that you knew was wrong and you felt like it was best to say nothing? Sometimes it is best to simply avoid and not return any kind of rebuke or retaliation. Sometimes when you are persecuted, maybe it is healthy to compete in a way that's driven by love, in a way that's driven by a motive to help someone understand your perspective. Boy, Jesus did this all the time with the Pharisees, didn't he? When the Pharisees said, why are you healing on the Sabbath? Jesus often responded with a question or even with a concern, but the question or concern was never about him being right. It was about helping them understand a different way of seeing something. You know, this happens to me a lot in ministry, and sadly, I'm reminded that I never know what's going on in the world of someone else, especially in the way they respond. Just this week, I received news of somebody that lost a pet, and they wanted to take a day off work. You know what my first reaction was? It's just a pet. Why would you take off work because your pet died? Don't you realize that life is hard? Life happens. But then once I decided to listen through the help of someone else who, frankly, was being a lot more Christ-like than I was, I learned that that person was not just mourning the loss of their pet, but they were mourning the loss of their own father who died in the same way that pet died. Now you may think that's odd, and you may think that's dramatic, but for that person who's grieving, that was a very real moment of grief that I treated in a very casual, defensive way. You see, Jesus doesn't want us to respond to anything we would receive as an attack with us needing to be right, which is why Jesus says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. You see, we confuse righteousness' sake with our need to be right. But it has nothing to do with our need to be right. It has everything to do with us walking in the way of God's righteousness. And if God's righteousness has been fully revealed in the person and work of Jesus, doesn't Jesus model for us mercy and love and forgiveness rather than needing to be right? Well, you may say, but Pat, Jesus was persecuted and stood up for what he believed in all the time. Against who? Let me ask you, who did Jesus take his stand against the most? It was religious people who were bent on being right about their interpretation of the law. You see, Jesus spent a lot of time with sick people. In fact, Jesus even says in 2 different Gospels, it's not the healthy who need the doctor, it is the sick. You know who sick people are? Sick people are people who think they are always right. Blessed are you when you are persecuted, not because you're right, but because God's righteousness is the way you're trying to live. And if that way, that direction is not filled with love and mercy and kindness and faithfulness, you are not headed in God's direction. You're headed towards your direction. So what does Jesus say? Rejoice and be glad. There's somebody else that said that. Paul. Over in Philippians, rejoice in the Lord always. And you know as well as I do, when Paul is writing to Philippians, he's writing from prison, right? Do you really think Paul is saying, hey, look, let's just be grateful and be cheerful that we're in prison? No, I think Paul is talking about a different source of joy. Joy doesn't come in being right. Joy comes in knowing who is holding you in the midst of feeling wronged. Joy comes in the midst of knowing that God is carrying you. God meets you right where you are in the midst of this deep offense, in the midst of being ridiculed. So when Paul comes to Philippians and he says, rejoice and be glad always, I think what Paul is referring to there is the same thing Jesus is referring to. In other words, I think Paul is looking at his situation through the lens of Jesus. It's a validation and it's an opportunity. Here's what I mean by that. It's a validation of knowing you're headed in the right direction. When someone hurls an insult at you because you are trying to do the Christ-like thing, when you are doing what you feel like love requires and demands of you, and somebody tells you that you just need to get a life and just be insulting back, to me, that's an indicator that you are headed in the right direction. I can't find anywhere in the story of Scripture where Jesus says, you know what, that's probably too much love for that person. I don't find it in the story of Scripture when Jesus says, you know, I think that's just too merciful. Let's back off a little bit. No. It's validation that you're heading in the right direction, but it's also an opportunity to learn something. Well, when you are persecuted, there are ways that you can learn about what it's like to be more Christian, what it's like to be more patient and more kind. I love the story of Dallas Willard when he was talking there at the University of Southern California as a philosophy professor about his deep faith and conviction in the story of Jesus. And a student stood up and basically took him to task and was very hurtful towards this professor in front of a whole group of classmates and students. This student was very, very rude and inappropriate. You know what Dallas Willard did? He dismissed class and said, that's all we've got for today. His grad assistant came around, which is, by the way, who was telling this story in a book that I read. His grad assistant came around and said, Dr. Willard, why did you allow that student to really take you to task? Why didn't you defend yourself? You could have torn him apart. And Dallas Willard said, you know, I'm really trying to embody the practice of not having to have the last word. To me, that's what Jesus is talking about. Blessed are you when you don't have to have the last word for righteousness' sake. For yours is the kingdom of heaven. We can't miss what Jesus says. Yours is the kingdom of heaven. It's a way to honor God as King, a way to remind yourself that God's got this, a way to say, you know, love is really the way. Love of God, love of neighbor. Could that be the best way forward in the midst of being hurt so deeply? Let me close by referencing one of my favorite quotes by Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was not just a civil rights activist. King was a preacher. He was a pastor. He didn't ask for this. In fact, the Southern Leadership Coalition asked him to help lead the civil rights movement. And King, because he was moving in that direction, found himself as the mouthpiece for the civil rights movement in the 60s. But you know this quote. King says, I'm going to stick with love because hate is too great a burden to bear. To me, that embodies the story of Jesus. That is incarnational, meaning that Jesus is embodying what it means to be human. Because to hate someone else is such a heavy burden. And I know this because there are some people that I have hated. There are some people that I don't like. There are some ways that I've been treated that are unfair, inappropriate, and worth my defensiveness. But I need to listen to the story of Jesus. I need to listen to the words of Jesus and hear Jesus say, Pat, blessed are you when people revile you, hurl insults at you, and say all kinds of untrue things about you on my account. But rejoice and be glad. Consider it validation that you're headed in the right direction and an opportunity to learn something, an opportunity to be grateful. Why? Because hate is too great a burden to bear. Stick with love. That doesn't mean that you stick with being the doormat for everyone's words, but it does mean that God is holding you no matter what comes your way, no matter what insults you receive. God is there. God is present. God is with you. Take these Beatitudes as your invitation to live deeper into this Christian life. Take these Beatitudes as moments of teaching that Jesus offers us as we head down the mountain towards people we relate with, and as we try to discover what it's like to be near to God. And be blessed. Not to receive something after you die, but a way to live now, knowing that Jesus is worth following. Thanks for joining us. I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Have a good day.